The Legends of the Jews, Volume 3, by Rabbi Louis Ginsberg, narrated by Michael Wright, Crested Butte, Colorado. The Long Road. The Exodus would have been impossible if Joseph's bones had remained behind. Therefore, Moses made it his concern to find their resting place, while the people had only thought of gathering in the treasures of Egypt. But it was not an easy matter to find Joseph's body. Moses knew that he had been interred in the mausoleum of the Egyptian kings, but there were so many other bodies there that it was impossible to identify it. Moses' mother, Jochebed, came to his aid. She led him to the very spot where Joseph's bones lay. As soon as he came near them, he knew them to be what he was seeking by the fragrance they exhaled and spread around. But his difficulties were not at an end. The question arose, how was he to secure possession of the remains? Joseph's coffin had been sunk so far into the ground that he knew not how to raise it from the depths. Standing at the edge of the grave, he spoke these words: "Joseph, the time has come which you prophesied when you said, 'God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones out from here.'" No sooner had this reminder dropped from his lips than the coffin stirred and rose to the surface. And even then the difficulties in Moses' way were not wholly removed. The Egyptian magicians had stationed 2 golden dogs at Joseph's coffin to keep watch, and they barked vehemently if anyone ventured close. The noise they made was so loud it could be heard throughout the land from end to end, a distance equal to a 40 days' journey. When Moses came near the coffin, the dogs emitted their warning sound, but he silenced them at once with the words, "Come, people, behold the miracle." The real live dogs did not bark, and these counterfeit dogs produced by magic attempted. What he said about real live dogs and their refraining from barking had reference to the fact that the dogs of the Egyptians did not move their tongues against any of the children of Israel. Though they had barked all the time, the people were engaged in burying the bodies of their smitten firstborn. As a reward, God gave the Israelites the law to throw to the dogs the flesh they themselves are forbidden to eat, for the Lord withholds due reward from none of his creatures. Indeed, the dogs received double reward, for their excrements are used in tanning the hides from which the Torah scrolls are made, as well as the mezuzot and the phylacteries. Joseph's coffin, now in the possession of Moses, the march of the Israelites could begin. The Egyptians put no obstacle in their way. Pharaoh himself accompanied them to make sure they were actually leaving the land. And now he was so angry at his counselors for having advised against letting the Israelites depart that he killed them. For several reasons, God did not permit the Israelites to travel along the straight road to the Promised Land. He made them to go to Sinai first and take the law on themselves there. Besides, the time divinely appointed for the occupation of the land by the Gentiles had not yet elapsed. Over and above all this, the long sojourn in the wilderness held much profit for the Israelites, spiritually and materially. If they had reached Palestine directly after leaving Egypt, they would have each devoted themselves entirely to the cultivation of his allotted parcel of ground, and no time would have been left for the study of the Torah. In the wilderness, they were relieved of the necessity of providing for their daily wants, and they would give all their efforts to acquiring the law. On the whole, it would not have been advantageous to proceed at once to the Holy Land and take possession. For when the Canaanites heard that the Israelites were headed towards Palestine, they burned the crops, felled the trees, destroyed the buildings, and choked the water springs, all in order to render the land uninhabitable. Then God spoke and said, "I did not promise their fathers a devastated land, but a land full of all good things. I will lead them about in the wilderness for 40 years, and meanwhile the Canaanites will have time to repair the damage they have done." Moreover, the many miracles performed for the Israelites during the journey through the wilderness caused terror to fall on the other nations. Their hearts melted, and there remained no fighting spirit in them. They did not venture to attack the Israelites, and the conquest of the land was made all the easier. There were still other reasons for preferring the longer route through the desert. Abraham had sworn a solemn oath to live at peace with the Philistines during a certain period, and the end of that term had not yet arrived. Besides, there was the fear that the sight of the land of the Philistines would awaken sad recollections in the Israelites and drive them back into Egypt speedily, for once upon a time it had been the scene of a bitter disappointment to them. They had spent 180 years in Egypt in peace and prosperity, not in the least molested by the people. Suddenly Gannon came, a descendant of Joseph of the tribe of Ephraim, and he spoke, "The Lord has appeared to me, and he told me to lead you out of Egypt." The Ephraimites were the only ones to heed his words. Proud of their royal lineage as direct descendants of Joseph and confident in their valor in war, for they were great heroes, they left the land and went to Palestine. They carried only weapons and gold and silver. They had taken no provisions, for they expected to buy food and drink on the way or capture them by force if the owners would not part with them for money. After a day's march, they found themselves in the neighborhood of Gath, at the place where the shepherds employed by the residents of the city gathered with the flocks. The Ephraimites asked them to sell some of the sheep, which they expected to slaughter in order to satisfy their hunger. But the shepherds refused to have business dealings with them, saying, "Are the sheep ours? Does the cattle belong to us, that we could part with them for money?" Seeing they could not gain their point by kindness, the Ephraimites used force. The outcries of the shepherd brought the people of Gath to their aid. A violent encounter lasting a whole day took place between the Israelites and the Philistines. The people of Gath realized that alone they would not be able to offer successful resistance to the Ephraimites, and they summoned the people of the other Philistine cities to join them. The following day, an army of 40,000 stood ready to oppose the Ephraimites. Reduced in strength as they were by 3 days' battle without food, they were exterminated root and branch. Only 10 of them escaped with their lives and returned to Egypt to bring Ephraim the words of the disaster, and he mourned many days. This abortive attempt of the Ephraimites to leave Egypt was the first occasion for oppressing Israel. After that, the Egyptians exercised force and vigilance to keep them in the land. As for the disaster of the Ephraimites, it was well-merited punishment, because they had paid no heed to the wish of the father Joseph, who had told his descendants solemnly, on his deathbed, not to think of quitting the land until the Redeemer should appear. The Ephraimites' death was followed by disgrace, for their bodies lay unburied for many years on the battlefield near Gath, and the purpose of God in directing the Israelites to choose the longer route from Egypt to Canaan was to spare them the sight of these dishonored corpses. Their courage might have deserted them, and out of apprehension of sharing the fate of their brethren, they might have hurried back to the land of slavery. Pharaoh pursues the Hebrews. When Pharaoh permitted Israel to depart, he was under the impression that they were going only a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, for the purpose of offering sacrifices. He sent officers with them whose duty was to bring them back at the appointed time. The exodus took place on a Thursday. On the following Sunday, the king's watchers noticed that the Israelites, far from preparing for a return, were making arrangements for a long sojourn in the desert. They remonstrated and urged them to go back. The Israelites maintained that Pharaoh had dismissed them for good, but the officers would not be put off with these mere assertions. They said, "Sooner or later, you will have to do as the powers that be command." To such arrogance, the Israelites would not submit. They fell on the officers, slaying some and wounding others. The wounded survivors went back to Egypt and reported the revolt of the Israelites to Pharaoh. Meantime, Moses, who did not desire the departure of his people to have the appearance of flight before the Egyptians, gave the signal to turn back to Pahahiroth. Those of little faith among the Israelites tore their hair and their garments in desperation, though Moses assured them that by the word of God they were free men and no longer slaves to Pharaoh. Accordingly, they retraced their steps to Pahahiroth, where two rectangular rocks form an opening, with which the great sanctuary of Baal-Zephon was situated. The rocks are shaped like human figures, the one a man, the other a woman, and they were not chiseled by human hands, but by the Creator himself. The place had been called Python in earlier times, but later, on account of the idols set up there, it received the name Hahiroth. For a purpose, God had left Baal-Zephon uninjured, alone of all the Egyptian idols. He wanted the Egyptian people to think that this idol was possessed of exceeding might, which it exercised to prevent the Israelites from journeying on. To confirm them in this false belief, God caused wild beasts to obstruct the road to the wilderness, and they took it for granted that their idol, Baal-Zephon, had ordered this appearance. Pahahiroth was famous besides on account of treasures heaped up there. The wealth of the world, which Joseph had acquired through the sale of corn he had stored up during the 7 years of plenty, he had divided into 3 parts. The first part he surrendered to Pharaoh. The second part he concealed in the wilderness, where it was found by Korah, though it disappeared again, not to come to view until the Messianic time, and then it will be for the benefit of the pious. The third part Joseph hid in the sanctuary of Baal-Zephon, and the Hebrews carried it off as booty. When Amalek and the magicians brought the information to Pharaoh that the Israelites had decided not to return to Egypt, his heart and the heart of his whole people turned against the Israelites. The very counselors that had persuaded him to dismiss the children of Israel spoke now as follows: "If we had only been smitten with the plagues, we could have resigned ourselves to our fate. Or, if besides being smitten with the plagues, we had been compelled to let the Hebrews depart from the land, that too we could have borne with some patience. But to be smitten with the plagues, to be compelled to let our slaves depart from us, and to sit by and see them go off with our riches, that is more than we can endure." Now that the children of Israel had gone, the Egyptians recognized how valuable an element they had been in their country. In general, the time of the exodus of Israel was disastrous for their former masters. In addition to losing their dominion over the Israelites, the Egyptians had to deal with mutinies that broke out among the other nations tributary to them. For before that, Pharaoh had been the ruler of the whole world. The king then resorted to blandishments and promises to induce the people to make war against the Israelites, saying, "As a rule, the army marches forth first and the king follows in security, but I will precede you. And as a rule, the king has first choice of the booty, and as much of it as he wants. But I will take no more than any one of you, and on my return from the war, I will divide my treasures of silver, gold, and precious stones among you." In his haste, Pharaoh did not wait to have his chariot made ready for him. He did it with his own hands, and his nobles followed his example. Samael granted Pharaoh assistance, putting 600 chariots manned with his own host at his disposal. These formed the vanguard, and they were joined by all the Egyptians with their vast assemblages of chariots and warriors, no less than 300 of their men to one of the children of Israel, each equipped with their different sorts of weapons. The general custom was for 2 charioteers to take turns at driving, but to overtake the Israelites more surely and speedily, Pharaoh ordered 3 to be assigned to each. The result was that they covered in 1 day the ground which it had taken the Israelites 3. The mind of the Egyptians was in no way directed toward spoil and plunder in this expedition. Their sole and determined purpose was to exterminate Israel, one and all. As the heathen lay great stress on omens when they are about to start out on a campaign, God caused all their preparations to proceed smoothly, without the slightest untoward circumstance. Everything pointed to a happy resolve. Pharaoh himself, adept in magic, had a presentiment that dire misfortune would befall the children of Israel in the wilderness, that they would lose Moses there, and the whole generation that had departed from Egypt would find its grave. Therefore he spoke to Dathan and Abiram, who had remained in Egypt, saying, Moses is leading them, but he knows not where. Truly, the congregation of Israel will lift up their voice in the wilderness and cry in fear, and there they will be destroyed. He thought naturally that these visions had reference to an imminent future, to the time of his meeting with his dismissed slaves, but his error was profound. He was hurrying towards his own destruction. When he reached the sanctuary of Baal-zephon, Pharaoh, in his joy at finding him spared while all the other idols in Egypt had been annihilated, lost no time in offering sacrifices to him. And he was comforted, for he said, Baal-zephon approves my purpose of drowning the children of Israel in the sea. When the Israelites beheld the huge detachments of the Egyptian army moving toward them, and when they considered that in Migdol there were other troops stationed besides, more indeed than their own numbers, men, women, and children all told, great terror overwhelmed them. What frightened them most was the sight of the angel of Egypt as he flew through the air to the assistance of the Egyptians. They turned to Moses, saying, What have you done to us? Now they will want revenge for all that has happened, that their firstborn were smitten, and we ran off with their money, which was your fault, for you took gold and silver from our Egyptian neighbors and departed with their property. The situation of the Israelites was desperate. Before them was the sea, behind them the Egyptians, and on both sides the wild beasts of the desert. The wicked among them spoke to Moses, saying, While we were in Egypt, we said to you and Aaron, The Lord look upon you and judge you, because you have made us abhorred in the eyes of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of his servants, to take a sword in their hand to slay us. Then there died many of our brethren during the days of darkness, which was worse than the bondage in which the Egyptians kept us. Nevertheless, our fate in the desert will be sadder than theirs. They at least were mourned, and their bodies buried. But our corpses will lie exposed, consumed in the day by drought, and by frost at night. Moses, in his wisdom, knew how to pacify the thousands and myriads under his leadership. He impressed them with the words, Fear not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. When will his salvation come? Questioned the people, and he told them it would appear the following day. But they protested, We will be destroyed by tomorrow. Then Moses prayed to God, and the Lord showed him the angel host standing ready to assist his people. They were not agreed what they were to do. There were 4 contending parties. The opinion of the first party was that they seek death by drowning in the sea. Of the second, that they return to Egypt. The third was in favor of a pitched battle with the Egyptians. And the fourth thought it would be a good plan to intimidate the Egyptians by noise and a great hubbub. To the first Moses said, Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. To the second, The Egyptians who you see today, you will see again no more, forever. To the third, The Lord shall fight for you. And to the fourth, You shall be quiet. What then shall we do? These asked. And Moses answered them, saying, You shall bless, praise, extol, adore, and glorify him, that is the Lord of war. Instead of the sword and the 5 sorts of arms which they bore, they made use of their mouth, and it was of greater avail than all possible weapons of war. The Lord heard their prayer, for which he had been waiting. Moses also addressed himself to God, saying, O Lord of the world, I am like the shepherd who, having undertaken to pasture a flock, has been careless enough to drive his sheep to the edge of a precipice, and then is in despair on how to get them back. Pharaoh is behind my flock Israel. In the south is Baal-zephon, in the north Migdol, and before us lies the sea. You know, O Lord, that it is beyond human strength and human contrivance to surmount the difficulties standing in our way. Yours alone is the work of procuring deliverance for this army, which left Egypt at your command. We despair of all other assistance or device, and we have recourse only to our hope in you. If there would be any escape possible, we look up to your providence to accomplish it for us." With such words, Moses continued to make fervent supplication to God to help Israel in their need. But God cut short his prayer, saying, "Moses, my children are in distress. The sea blocks the way before them, the enemy is in hot pursuit after them, and you stand here and pray." Sometimes long prayer is good, but sometimes it is better to be brief. If I gathered the waters together into one place and let the dry land appear for Adam, a single human being, should I not do the same for this holy congregation? I will save them, if only for the merits of Abraham, who stood ready to sacrifice his son Isaac to me, and for the sake of my promise to Jacob. The sun and moon are witnesses that I will part the sea for the seed of the children of Israel, who deserve my help for following after me in the wilderness unquestioningly. But see to it that they abandon their evil thought of returning to Egypt, and then it will not be necessary to turn to me and entreat my help. Moses, however, was still very much troubled in mind on account of Samael, who had not left off lodging accusations before God against Israel since the exodus from Egypt. The Lord adopted the same procedure in dealing with the accuser as the experienced shepherd who, at the moment of transferring his sheep across his stream, was faced by a ravening wolf. The shepherd threw a strong ram to the wolf, and while the two engaged in combat, the rest of the flock was carried across the water, and then the shepherd returned to snatch the wolf's supposed prey away from him. Samael said to the Lord, "Up to this time the children of Israel were idol worshippers, and now you propose so great a thing as dividing the sea for them?" What did the Lord do? He surrendered Job to Samael, saying, "While he busies himself with Job, Israel will pass through the sea unscathed, and as soon as they are in safety, I will rescue Job from the hands of Samael." Israel had other angel adversaries besides. Uzzah, the angel of the Egyptians, appeared before God and said, "O Lord of the world, I have an issue with this nation which you have brought out of Egypt. If it seems well to you, let their angel Michael appear and contend with me." The Lord summoned Michael, and Uzzah stated his charges against Israel. "O Lord of the world, you did decree concerning this people Israel that it is to be held bondage by my people, the Egyptians, for a period of 400 years. But they have had dominion over them only 86 years, and therefore the time of their going forth has not yet arrived. If it be your will, give me permission to take them back to Egypt, that they may continue in slavery for the 314 years that are left, and your word be fulfilled. As you are immutable, so let your decree be immutable." Michael was silent, for he knew not how to contend with these words, and it seemed as if Uzzah had won his case. But the Lord himself took up the cause of Israel, and he said to Uzzah, "The duty of serving your nation was laid upon my children only on account of an unseemly word uttered by Abraham, when I spoke to him, saying, 'I am the Lord that brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land.' He made answer, 'How shall I know I will inherit it?' Then I said to him, 'Your seed shall be a stranger.' But it is well known and manifest before me that they were strangers from the day of Isaac's birth, and reckoning so, the period of 400 years has elapsed, and you have no right to keep my children in bondage any longer." The sea divided. Then God spoke to Moses, saying, "Why do you stand here praying? My children's prayer has anticipated yours. For you there is nothing to do but lift up your rod and stretch your hand out over the sea and divide it." Moses replied, "You command me to divide the sea and lay bare the dry ground in the middle of it? And yet you yourself made a perpetual decree. The sand is the boundary of the sea." And again God spoke to Moses, "You have not read the beginning of the Torah. I did speak, 'Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear.' And at that time I made the extra condition that the waters shall divide before Israel. Take the rod that I gave you, and go to the sea and speak. I am the messenger sent by the Creator of the world. Uncover your paths, O sea, for my children, that they may go through the midst of you on dry ground." Moses spoke to the sea as God had bidden him, but it replied, "I will not do according to your words, for you are only a man born of woman, and besides, I am 3 days older than you." Moses lost no time and carried back to God the words the sea had spoken, and the Lord said, "Moses, what does a master do with an intractable servant?" "He beats him with a rod," said Moses. "Do so," ordered God. "Lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it." Then Moses raised up his rod, the rod that had been created at the very beginning of the world, and which were engraved in plain letters the great and exalted name, the names of the 10 plagues inflicted upon the Egyptians, and the names of the 3 fathers, the 6 mothers, and the 12 tribes of Jacob. This rod he lifted up and stretched out over the sea. The sea, however, continued in its perverseness. Moses entreated God to give his command to direct it. But God refused, saying, "Were I to command the sea to divide, it would never again return to its former estate. Therefore, you convey my order to it, that it not be drained dry forever. But I will let a semblance of my strength accompany you, and that will compel its obedience." When the sea saw the strength of God at the right hand of Moses, it spoke to the earth, saying, "Make hollow places for me, that I may hide myself before the Lord of all created things. Blessed be he." Noticing the terror of the sea, Moses said, "For a whole day I spoke to you at the bidding of the Holy One, who desired you to divide. But you refused to heed my words. Even when I showed you my rod, you remained obdurate. What has happened now that you run?" The sea replied, "I am fleeing not before you, but before the Lord of all created things, that his name may be magnified in all the earth." And the waters of the Red Sea divided, and not they alone, but all the waters in earth and on heaven, in whatever vessel it was in cisterns, in wells, in caves, in casks, in pitchers, in drinking cups, and in glasses, and none of these waters returned to their former estate until Israel had passed through the sea on dry land. The angel Gabriel was eager to drown the Egyptians during the same night, but God made him wait until early the next day, until the hour of the morning watch, when Abraham had made himself ready to set out for the sacrifice of his son. Gabriel succeeded, however, in holding back the turbulent waters about to sweep over Israel. To the wall of water on the right he called, "Beware of Israel, who will receive the law in time to come from the right hand of the Lord." And turning to the water on the left, he said, "Beware of Israel, who will wind the phylacteries about their left hand in time to come." The water behind, he admonished, "Beware of Israel, who will let the zizit drop down upon their back in time to come." And to the water towering in front of them he called, "Beware of Israel, who bears the sign of the covenant on their bodies." God caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind, the wind he always makes use of when he chastises the nations. The same east wind had brought the deluge. It had laid the Tower of Babel in ruins. It was the cause of the destruction of Samaria, Jerusalem, and Tyre, and it will, in the future, be the instrument for castigating Rome, drunken with pleasure, and likewise the sinners in Gehenna are punished by means of the east wind. All night long God made it blow over the sea. To prevent the enemy from inflicting harm upon the Israelites, he enveloped the Egyptians in profound darkness, so impenetrable it could be felt, and none could move or change his posture. He that sat, when it fell, could not rise from his place, and he that stood could not sit down. Nevertheless, the Egyptians could see that the Israelites were surrounded by bright light, and were enjoying a banquet where they stood. And when they tried to shoot darts and arrows against them, the missiles were caught up by the cloud and by the angels hovering between the two camps, so that no harm came to Israel. Next, the passage through the Red Sea. End part 46 of 95, theLegendsOfTheJews.com.